After losing everything, an indigent mother left her baby at an orphanage's door. Years later, he appeared as a famous doctor, desperately searching for her. Maria walked unsteadily down the deserted street, the torrential rain soaking her to the bone. Each drop crashing against her skin seemed to remind her of the urgent need to escape, the need to protect her baby from Richard's uncontrollable rage. The icy wind blew fiercely, whipping her wet hair around and chilling the silent tears that slid down her marked cheeks. Little Daniel's heartbreaking cries mingled with the thunder, echoing in the loneliness of that moonless night. Her legs ached from running, yet she pushed on with the determination of someone who has no other choice. She didn't dare look back, fearing that Richard's silhouette might be following her in the darkness. She recalled how, just hours before, he had lost his temper over something as trivial as a child's cry. His anger was so terrifying that Maria understood she had to act immediately to protect her son. Those blows, along with the constant threats, had convinced her there was no more time to lose. In the distance, she could make out the imposing facade of the Smith mansion. The lights shining from its windows offered a faint beacon of hope in the surrounding darkness. Each clap of thunder briefly illuminated the home's thick walls, making it appear and vanish before her tired eyes. Maria didn't know the owners of the mansion, but rumors around the neighborhood spoke of the generosity of those who lived there. She clung to that hope as she pressed Daniel against her chest, shielding him from the cold and the relentless gusts of wind. Nearly out of breath, she reached the foot of the main staircase. Her heart was pounding harder than ever, fueled by terror and an unwavering mother's love. With every step, the world seemed to shrink to just her and her baby, the storm and the threat of an even greater danger. When she finally stood before the heavy wooden door, she felt her knees buckle with exhaustion, and a chill ran the length of her body. Even so, she found the strength to hold Daniel gently and kiss his forehead with infinite tenderness. In the dimness, with rain drumming on the rooftop, she pulled out a small note she had scribbled moments earlier. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely hold it. She placed it carefully in Daniel's blanket, though she feared the drops of rain would smudge the few written words. As she settled him delicately on the threshold, she felt something inside her tear apart. This was the hardest decision she had ever made. A stifled sob emerged from her throat as she realized that, from that moment on, her little boy would be alone, at the mercy of strangers. For an instant, she hesitated about whether to knock or pound loudly on the door. Maybe there was still a chance to turn back, to find somewhere safe to raise Daniel away from Richard. But she knew that possibility was almost non-existent. She had spent too long cornered, threatened, and without resources. The night of the beating, when she saw Richard's rage turn into a real danger for the baby, she understood there was no more time to wait. Her only hope was that, in that unknown home, Daniel would find a chance to survive and be loved. With her hand pressed against the wood, she paused in uncertainty. She heard the baby utter a faint whimper between booming thunderclaps, and her heart pounded so hard it felt ready to shatter. Then reality hit. She couldn't back out. She would flee, carrying guilt and pain, yes, but in exchange for her son's life. Letting go of the door, she stepped back hesitantly. Water streamed down her forehead, blurring her vision, yet she could still sense the immense emptiness left behind. The storm raged with renewed force, perhaps a warning of the loneliness she would now face. She turned around, clinging only to the hope that the mansion's residents would welcome him. With her clothes soaked and her soul in pieces, she began running once more, disappearing into the darkness entirely. As she ran away, she heard Daniel's cries fade into the clamor of the rain, echoing in her ears like a heartbeat. That night, with a broken heart, Maria carried out the sacrificial act she believed was necessary to save her child from an even more horrible fate. Victor Smith woke up startled when a sharp cry cut through the stillness of dawn. His heart lurched as if that sob had pierced the walls of the house to call out to him. He sat upright in bed, breathing heavily, noticing that the darkness felt heavier than usual. Next to him, Amelia slept deeply, unaware of the unease that had seized him. Moving cautiously, Victor slipped on his slippers and walked toward the bedroom door, not yet willing to wake his wife. As he walked the long hallway, he sensed an odd draft. The windows were shut, yet something kept blowing persistently, sending a slight shiver down his spine. He tried to locate the source of the breeze and, after a few moments, deduced it was coming from the foyer near the main entrance. He opened the wooden door that separated the hall from the reception area and was met with an unusual sight. The front door was ajar, allowing the night air to flow in freely. He approached carefully, hearing again that pained cry that had broken his sleep. A chill spread across his back when he remembered that Smith Mansion was far from the city's more populated areas, making it unusual for anyone to be wandering around at this hour. With a mix of curiosity and disquiet, he placed his hand on the door and opened it fully. On the threshold, in the darkness, he made out the small figure of a baby wrapped in a blanket so thin it hardly shielded him from the freezing air. The child was trembling, his face soaked with tears, and his cry caught in his throat. Victor felt a knot form inside him. He had never seen a child so defenseless and yet so urgently in need of help. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, paralyzed, staring into those eyes that seemed to plead for shelter. Finally, he snapped out of it and bent down to lift the baby with infinite care. At that moment, he noticed a note pinned to the blanket, and upon reading it, he realized it contained only a single message. Daniel, take care of him. Victor's heart skipped a beat when he recognized the name hastily written there. He thought about how desperate the person who left the baby must have been, trusting that the Smith family would protect him. His hands began to tremble from emotion, and almost without realizing it, he whispered, Daniel, softly, as though speaking the name might help him understand this child's sudden appearance in his life. That was when Amelia showed up in the foyer, loosely tying her robe over her nightgown, her hair tousled from sleep. She had woken to find her husband missing, and upon stepping into the hallway, had felt the same cold gust of air he felt moments earlier. She froze at the sight of Victor holding a baby. For a moment, surprise lit up her eyes, soon replaced by boundless tenderness. Taking hesitant steps, she approached to look at that little one crying inconsolably. Where did he come from? She managed to ask, her quivering voice betraying that she might already suspect the answer. Victor showed her the note and repeated aloud what he had just read. Amelia held out her arms for Daniel, feeling his slight tremble against her chest. In that moment, a long-forgotten maternal longing, which she had assumed was in her past, surged inside her, rekindling a desire to protect and love this helpless child. The couple decided to call the authorities immediately, but they discovered that the emergency lines were overwhelmed by the storm striking the region. From the other end of the line, they were told the police would do their best to come, but there was no guarantee it would be right away. Victor and Amelia exchanged a knowing glance. They needed no further discussion to agree that Daniel would remain in their care at least for that night. After closing the door to keep the warmth in, they headed to a small sitting room off the foyer where there was a comfortable sofa and an unlit fireplace. Victor lit the fire and the flames began to dance, casting a warm glow on the walls. Amelia, sitting on the sofa with the child in her arms, wrapped him in a dry blanket and soothed his cries with gentle caresses. Deeply moved, she felt her heart pounding, as if baby Daniel's arrival signified something truly life-changing. During the following hours, the couple barely slept. They took turns tending to the baby, wondering who had left him there and why such a desperate choice had been made. Amelia kept pressing soft kisses to his forehead in an instinctive maternal gesture, and Victor, filled with quiet wonder, stayed close to both of them. When the first light of dawn appeared, they knew their next step would be to formalize Daniel's custody and give him everything he needed to thrive. Neither of them could guess how deeply that act of kindness would alter their lives. In some corner of their minds, the certainty grew that life had placed both a challenge and a responsibility before them. That morning, as they gazed at Daniel's sleeping face, they realized destiny had given them the chance to become parents by heart, even if not by blood. They set aside their doubts and fears, convinced they had done the right thing. Thus, with sunrise lighting up the Smith mansion, the front door closed once more with a soft click, as if the home were preparing to welcome a new member of the family. The chirping of birds mingled with Daniel's first quiet sighs, for he at last appeared to be sleeping peacefully in a warm place. In Victor and Amelia's minds, a spark of hope began to glow for whatever might come, unaware that this small disruption to their daily lives would change their destinies forever. Richard remained in a seedy dive, letting cigarette smoke blur his vision. He had spent several days stewing in a bitter resentment that he couldn't dispel, no matter how much cheap liquor he gulped down. His hands shook with fury each time he recalled the disappearance of Maria, his partner, along with the baby. That affront was inconceivable to a man like him, used to enforcing his will through threats and violence. In the dark atmosphere of the bar, light was dim, barely illuminating the bottles lined up behind the counter. Richard sought answers between drinks, glaring hostilely at the few brave enough to approach him. A couple of acquaintances had told him they saw Maria flee the city on a stormy night with her child in her arms. Every time he heard that story, he felt his authority called into question, fueling the rage festering within. While he ranted about her and cursed her cowardice, scattered images of that final fight replayed in his mind. He remembered the baby's desperate wails and the terror in Maria's eyes when he, beside himself with anger, burst in yelling threats. It was intolerable to him that she, whom he viewed as nothing more than his property, had dared to leave without his consent. In Richard's eyes, such defiance demanded severe punishment. Meanwhile, Maria had sought shelter in a safe house on the outskirts of another city. She arrived with bruises on her face and clear signs of abuse, dragging a small bag of belongings and bearing a soul shattered by her baby's separation. The volunteers there provided medical and psychological help, but Maria remained silent, terrified that someone might discover her whereabouts and force her back into Richard's fury. At night, while the other women slept, she barely closed her eyes. She tossed and turned in bed, recalling the night she had left Daniel at the doorstep of the Smith mansion. Even without knowing them, she had sensed that those people might care for her son better than she could at that desperate moment. Yet the doubts continued to plague her. Was he safe? Or had she made a mistake that would condemn him to live far from his mother's love? Sometimes, when she felt somewhat calmer, she mentally revisited the reasons behind her decision. Richard was not only violent with her, he had started to vent his rage on the baby whenever the child's crying or any minor fuss irritated him. Maria shuddered to remember the real danger Daniel faced by staying at her side. Deep down, she remained convinced that leaving him on that doorstep was the only way to protect him. The other women at the shelter tried to approach her with empathy, sharing their own experiences with abuse. However, Maria couldn't shake off the fear that arose at the mere mention of Richard. She lived in constant horror that he would track her down, break into that safe haven, and rob her of the chance to rebuild her life. Still, there was a mixture of relief and pain in thinking that, for the time being, Daniel would remain out of that man's reach. Richard, meanwhile, was obsessed with discovering their whereabouts. To him, the fact that Maria had dared to defy him was an unforgivable insult he could not ignore. He hired henchmen to search the city and surrounding areas, waving blurry photographs and asking on every street corner if anyone had seen a woman with a baby. With each passing day, his frustration grew as he got no solid leads, and his thirst for revenge became more relentless. In those moments of delirium, between cigarette smoke and the harsh taste of cheap liquor, Richard would mutter under his breath that he wouldn't rest until he regained control of his life. For him, Maria was a symbol of his power, and Daniel an instrument to secure his supremacy. He never suspected, however, that the young mother's sacrifice was about to change forever, not only the destiny of his son, but also that of the family who had taken the child in. As the night wore on in that disreputable neighborhood, the shadows of a violent past began to lengthen, threatening to ensnare everyone in a new spiral of suffering and desperate searching. Leonard arrived at the Smith mansion early that morning, with an elegant bearing and a show of feigned curiosity that belied the tension pounding in his chest. Rumors among the staff had reached him that his brother, Victor, and Victor's wife, Amelia, had taken in an abandoned baby. The news startled him and at the same time irritated him. He couldn't understand what reasons might have led Victor to make such a decision, much less how this child, who did not share Smith blood, might fit into the carefully laid succession plans Leonard had been plotting in silence for years. Stepping out of his car, he glanced at the immaculate gardens, adorned with expertly tended flowers. The butler, with his customary courtesy, came out to greet him. Leonard answered with a forced smile, striving to hide the suspicion gnawing at him. For some time, he had coveted the position of honor his brother held, both in the family business and the highest social circles, where the Smith name opened doors and guaranteed unique prestige. As he walked through the foyer, he noticed a photograph of Victor and Amelia on a side wall. It was taken at a charity event, with a plaque highlighting the couple's philanthropic work. For Leonard, each one of those achievements was a step his brother had taken toward consolidating his standing, leaving him perpetually in the shadows. His envy intensified at the thought that, in addition to his lauded generosity, Victor was now adding an apparent act of heroism by taking in a helpless baby. He wondered if that move was not a masterstroke to gain even more acclaim. Entering the main living room, he found Victor and Amelia seated on a sofa, their faces calm, but with a special glow in their eyes. In Amelia's arms was the newcomer, a child barely a few months old, swaddled in a blanket, his gaze still uncertain. Leonard noticed that, despite the apparent composure, there was a slight tension in the air, as though everyone were waiting for his reaction. He forced a smile, while inside him, discomfort simmered. "What a surprise, brother," he exclaimed, feigning enthusiasm he didn't feel. "I've heard you had an unexpected visitor. Do you really plan on adopting this baby?" Victor nodded gently and explained that they had found the little one on their doorstep in the early hours of the morning, with only a brief note attached. He added that the police, unable to locate the mother right away, had left him and Amelia to provide for the baby, whom they called Daniel, after the name on the blanket. While he spoke, Leonard mulled over every word, trying to gauge whether this situation might help or hinder his own plans. "A very noble gesture on your part," Leonard added, feigning sincere admiration. "But I suppose you're aware that all this may have legal implications." Victor exchanged a glance with Amelia, though neither seemed overly concerned. They were determined to assume responsibility for the baby, the only clue to his identity being the name left behind with him. Leonard watched with wariness. He had no intention of sparking an outright conflict with his brother, needing to keep up at least a facade of cordiality. Nevertheless, he couldn't help but wonder whether Daniel's adoption would pose a stumbling block for future inheritances or, conversely, create a weak spot he could exploit later on. On his way out of the mansion, an idea began taking root in his mind. If the child was not related by blood, there might be a way to challenge any family claim he could make in the future. As he drove away, he contemplated a long-term scenario. If Victor were to name Daniel as his heir, Leonard could resort to legal arguments to have him declared illegitimate. He wondered if there would be formal adoption papers and whether such proceedings might be subject to annulment. A faint smile flickered on his lips at the prospect of reclaiming the position he had always desired. Meanwhile, the Rosales family, longtime associates of the Smith clan, kept a close watch on events at the mansion. For some months, rumors had circulated of a rift between these two families, fueled by disagreements over certain investments and joint ventures. Capitalizing on this underlying tension, Some Rosales kin had started spreading spiteful remarks about the mysterious baby's arrival, insisting that a true Smith would never accept a stranger into their midst. With each bit of gossip, chatter swelled among the city's high society circles, stoking speculation that something dark was unfolding behind the mansion's doors. Leonard, aware of such rumors, could see a way to benefit from the growing intrigue. Each new visit or offhand comment in close circles fed into the sense that a silent conflict was brewing and would explode sooner or later. He was in no rush. He watched developments patiently, making note of his brother's words and actions to decide on his own next moves, waiting for the right moment to strike without error. In the days that followed, tension around the Smith mansion mounted, fueled by the interest the baby's presence sparked in both friends and meddlers. Victor and Amelia, however, seemed to focus on protecting Daniel, indifferent or dismissive of the stares and whispers swirling around them. At this crossroads of rivalries and budding secrets, Leonard reflected on how to turn the child's arrival into a weak point for his brother. He wondered if, with a single well-aimed blow, he might at last seize the privileged place he had always coveted. For Leonard, ambition tilted the scales, and he was determined not to let an abandoned baby derail the plans he had clung to all his life. While the shadows of intrigue crept around the mansion, he bided his time, certain that the perfect opportunity was coming to undermine Victor's position and elevate his own name to the pinnacle of the Smith clan. Time moved on like a gentle breeze, slowly transforming life at the Smith mansion. Daniel, the baby found on that stormy night, grew up surrounded by comforts, but also guided by the discipline and values that Victor and Amelia instilled in him from an early age. Among the stately halls and immaculate gardens, he learned to be thankful for every privilege he enjoyed and to feel empathy for those who were not as fortunate. Even as a child, Daniel showed great interest in the charitable activities organized by Amelia. She brought him along to the distribution of clothes and food in underprivileged communities, where he encountered a reality far removed from his own life of luxury. Over the years, this social awareness solidified. He marveled at how even a small act of kindness could brighten the faces of those in need. Thus, almost without realizing it, he developed a spirit of service that sprang from deep within his heart. As he grew, his curiosity about how the human body worked and the diseases that afflicted people of lesser means led him toward medicine. He loved eavesdropping on doctors and nurses at the health camps, occasionally sponsored by the Smith Foundation. He would draw near to ask questions or offer help with simple tasks like handing out brochures or organizing medical supplies. His smile and dedication in these endeavors caught people's attention, revealing his innate calling to care for others. Academically, Daniel was a diligent student. He showed a strong aptitude for research and excelled in his studies. When he reached his teens, Victor provided all the support needed for him to continue along that path. Victor felt genuine pride, seeing in Daniel the fruit of the decision he and Amelia had made years ago, the night they took in a defenseless baby. Meanwhile, Leonard, Victor's elder brother, kept his distance, neither openly hostile nor particularly close. He observed Daniel's development with an air of indifference, yet from time to time made remarks betraying his distrust of the young man. When Daniel turned 25, he graduated with honors from medical school, realizing a dream he had nurtured for so long. To celebrate, Amelia and Victor hosted a small reception at the mansion, inviting a few close friends and some professors who had been pivotal in Daniel's training. During the gathering, Daniel felt immense gratitude as he looked at his adoptive parents, reassured that his hard work had been worthwhile. Many were unaware that the young doctor had no Smith blood in his veins, but in Victor and Amelia's eyes, he had more than earned his place in the family. After graduation, Daniel formally joined the Smith Foundation's projects. Its main building stood in a central part of the city, from which various initiatives were coordinated to aid disadvantaged communities. Daniel proposed expanding vaccination campaigns and offering free checkups to prevent common diseases. His enthusiasm and energy were contagious, encouraging volunteers and healthcare professionals to become more actively involved. It was during one of these humanitarian missions that he met Eleanor, a nurse who regularly volunteered at the foundation. From the moment they crossed paths, they exchanged cordial smiles and introduced themselves politely, a courtesy that quickly grew into a warm rapport. Elena noticed Daniel's unwavering dedication to every patient he treated, whether it was an elderly person with chronic conditions or a child with a simple cold. That sincere vocation to serve united them, and after each campaign, they talked animatedly about the community's needs and the importance of preventive medicine. At first, their relationship stayed strictly professional. However, with each new vaccination drive, with every visit to rural areas, and with each moment of unspoken closeness, their feelings grew. Neither spoke aloud about it, but one only had to notice how they sought each other out with their eyes to sense there was something deeper than mere affinity in their exchanges. After a few months, they started spending time together outside foundation activities, discovering they shared a love of classical music, a passion for literature, and, most importantly, an appreciation for each other's company. While the foundation thrived thanks to Daniel's renewed energy, the atmosphere at the Smith mansion reflected a growing trust in the young doctor. Victor and Amelia supported his initiatives and celebrated his generous spirit, recognizing in him the seed they had planted so many years before. Daniel, for his part, was beginning to relish the satisfaction of helping others in a direct manner, confirming that his professional choice was driven by genuine vocation and an innate desire to repay the blessings life had granted him. Those years of growth and learning thus went by, marked by his medical calling and the development of a special bond with Elena. Although on the surface everything seemed peaceful, fate continued weaving invisible threads that would connect Daniel's past with still hidden secrets. Unaware of it, the young doctor was beginning to tread a path that would lead him to face uncomfortable questions about his true origins, an origin that lay waiting, always latent, just around the next page of his story. The passage of time had left Victor Smith weary, although out of pride or caution, he never admitted it publicly. At 75, he continued to serve as president of the family business with a dedication that astonished both employees and executives. Still, those who knew him well noticed that in recent meetings, he often pressed a hand to his chest and closed his eyes for a few moments, as though the pangs he felt were merely a passing inconvenience. Despite Amelia's advice that he get a checkup, he insisted it was nothing serious. One morning, during a key meeting at the main office, an unexpected fainting spell cut the discussion short. Victor collapsed without warning, leaving everyone present in a state of alarm. They rushed him to the nearest hospital, where the doctors received him in critical condition. News of the incident reached Daniel, who was tending patients at a charity event for the Smith Foundation. Upon hearing what had happened, he left his colleagues in charge and ran to the hospital, his heart heavy with worry, and his mind flooded by memories of the childhood he had shared with the man he had always considered his father. Once in the emergency room, Daniel, despite his obvious anxiety, acted with the same composure he would have shown any other patient. He knew he had to remain calm to help the medical team. Inwardly, he was consumed by an intense fear of losing the father figure who had given him shelter, education, and most of all, unwavering love. Amelia, meanwhile, stood beside the gurney, her eyes brimming with concern and her hands shaking. Even though she had faith in Daniel's skill as a physician, she couldn't erase from her mind the image of Victor suddenly collapsing, as if the weight of his years and responsibilities had all come crashing down at once. Victor's condition was serious. Initial tests revealed cardiac problems that would require treatment and strict rest, something difficult to accept for a man so used to leading. While the specialists debated the best medical approach, Leonard arrived, wearing a grim expression and looking profoundly worried. He greeted Daniel and Amelia with a terse nod, then moved closer to his brother's bedside, watching him in silence. Inside, he wrestled with mixed emotions. On the one hand, he feared Victor's death. On the other, he suspected this crisis could reshape the control of the business and the family inheritance, something he had contemplated more than once. Finally granted permission to visit, they found Victor feverish, muttering in confusion. Under the effects of painkillers, he blurted out disconnected phrases, as though some memory insisted on breaking through the shadows. Daniel, hanging on every word, thought he heard something about not having had the courage to tell him before. The young man's heart skipped a beat. What was his father referring to? Was it merely a fever-induced delirium, or something deeper Victor had kept hidden for years? Standing at the bedside, Amelia felt a chill at those words she had feared so long. She recalled the pact of silence she and Victor had upheld since the night they found the abandoned baby outside the mansion. A knot in her throat, she silently begged her husband to regain his senses and not reveal what had cost them so much effort to conceal. At the same time, a part of her felt guilty, aware that Daniel might have the right to know the truth about his origins. In the room, the tension became palpable. Leonard furrowed his brow, sensing a glimmer of mystery in the air, one that he guessed might prove useful in his future plans. Still, he concealed his interest, feigning concern solely for his brother's health. Daniel, meanwhile, could not hold back, and quietly asked if his father was talking about some unresolved business or family matter. Amelia avoided his gaze, fearful that words might betray her. Several hours passed with doctors and nurses coming and going. Daniel took part in drafting a care plan, suggesting medications and further tests. His professional dedication couldn't quell the whirlwind of questions churning inside him. He had heard vague stories related to the day of his adoption, but his parents had always surrounded him with love and security, so he had never imagined there might be a major secret behind it all. At last, late that evening, Amelia and Daniel were allowed to remain in the room, while Leonard left under the pretext of attending to urgent company matters. The silence was broken when Victor, opening his eyes with difficulty, grasped Daniel's hand and looked at him with deep emotion. He mumbled a few muddled words that Amelia barely understood. Daniel leaned in to hear more clearly, and at that moment, he noticed the sorrow etched on his father's face. "I'll tell you," Victor managed to say, before drifting once again into a medication-induced haze. In that faint whisper, Daniel thought he recognized the hint of a heavy burden his father had been carrying. A blend of anxiety and tenderness overwhelmed him. He longed to know the truth, but feared the pain it might bring. Amelia, at his side, fought between her guilt and her love for both of them. She realized that perhaps the moment of confessions had finally arrived, risking the stability of the family they had worked so hard to build. Still, the night wore on with no new revelations. Victor sank into a restless slumber, watched over by monitors tracking his vital signs. Daniel remained by his side, keeping vigil not only over his father's health, but also over the echo of those fragmented words that threatened to stir the waters of the past. Meanwhile, Amelia prayed silently that if the truth emerged, Daniel would face it with the fortitude and kindness that had made him the man he was. Uncertainty lingered in the air, foreshadowing that a critical chapter in the life of the Smith family was on the verge of unfolding. Victor opened his eyes, feeling a crushing weight on his chest, not only from his heart condition, but also from the flood of emotions overwhelming him. Focusing his gaze, he could see Daniel sitting in the chair next to the bed, his face tense with worry. The young man stood at once, leaning in to ask how he felt, while Amelia, a few steps away, looked on with mingled relief and fear. Victor knew, in that exact moment, that the time had come to speak, to confess what he had been hiding for so long. With a weak, trembling voice, he called Daniel closer. The young man obeyed, bending down to hear the strained words escaping his father's lips. Victor started by stammering apologies, speaking of fear and love, of a promise he had made to himself from the night he found Daniel on the doorstep of the Smith mansion. A tight knot formed in his throat, making it nearly impossible to say aloud the confession he had rehearsed silently so many times. Even so, he drew a deep breath and went on. In halting intervals, he explained that he was not Daniel's biological father. He recounted how, many years before, in the middle of a terrible storm, he had found a baby wrapped in a thin blanket, along with a note that mentioned only Daniel's name and a plea to care for him. He remembered how that night he felt a mixture of compassion and confusion, and how, without hesitating, he and Amelia took the child in, fearing for the fragility of that tiny figure who cried inconsolably. Daniel listened to every word as if he were trapped in a dream from which he couldn't awaken. He felt a strange heat rising along his spine, together with a jolt of disbelief. He had always thought he was a smith by birth. All his childhood memories revolved around the mansion, around his parents' care, around Victor's lessons on life and work. He struggled to grasp how the man who had raised him, who had watched him grow and supported his passion for medicine, did not share his blood. Sensing Daniel's disorientation, Amelia approached hesitantly. She retrieved from a small drawer in the hospital room the note and the blanket they had saved as precious keepsakes. Holding them to her chest for a few seconds, she trembled at the memory of all the love and guilt bound to that first night. Then she handed them to Daniel, pleading forgiveness for so many years of silence. The young man took the blanket carefully, as though it were an irreplaceable treasure, and ran his hand over the now worn fabric, tracing the faded letters of his name. Daniel. Next, he read the brief note, struggling to imagine the mother who, likely in tears, had written it hastily before leaving him at the mansion's door. A surge of emotions overwhelmed him. On one hand, endless gratitude toward Victor and Amelia, for without them, he would never have had the life he knew. On the other, a crushing sense of emptiness upon realizing he knew nothing of his origins. "Why did you never tell me?" he asked in a hoarse voice, not daring to look directly at his adoptive parents. He felt dazed, while also aware that their answer might unearth even more conflicting emotions. Victor closed his eyes before replying. He explained that at first, he and Amelia feared Daniel wouldn't accept them if he learned the truth too soon. As time passed, it became harder and harder to reveal it, because they felt genuinely bonded to him. They were afraid of causing him unnecessary pain, or of tearing apart the family image they had worked so hard to build. Eventually, the shame of having kept silent for so long paralyzed them, and they kept putting off the conversation, waiting for the right moment that never came. Tears welling up, Amelia begged him to understand. She assured him they had loved him with all their hearts and had never treated him differently from a child of their own blood. Seeing the honesty and affection in both their gazes, Daniel felt anger and confusion intermingling with the profound love he bore them. He moved closer to his adoptive mother and hugged her tightly, wordless, letting his tears fall on her shoulder. After a few moments, he straightened and looked back at the note. He felt an urgent need to learn about the woman who had abandoned him, not just to understand her story, but also to forge a connection to his biological roots. Even so, his love for Victor and Amelia remained unbroken. In fact, he was grateful to have ended up in the care of such noble people who guided him toward kindness and medicine. Yet a part of him clamored for answers that went beyond the blanket and the note. The hospital monitors broke the silence with a soft beep, reminding everyone of Victor's fragile health. Daniel looked at him lying there, struggling to breathe, and was overwhelmed by a rush of tenderness and concern. He promised to do everything within his power to care for him and vowed not to let this revelation alter their bond. Deep in his soul, however, a new resolve was taking shape: to find out who his biological mother was and why she had left him on that doorstep one night, entrusting his fate to a stranger. Daniel left the hospital with a heart full of uncertainty. Victor's confession about his true origins had plunged him into a whirlwind of thoughts. The cool outdoor air contrasted with the heavy atmosphere he had just escaped, and each step away from the building where his father was recovering did nothing to relieve the emotional turmoil consuming him. During the car ride back to the Smith Foundation, he stared out the window without really seeing anything, turning over and over in his mind the words that, until only moments ago had defined his identity. Upon arrival, he went straight to his office, seeking temporary refuge in the routine of reviewing case files and planning medical outreach campaigns. However, every file he opened reminded him of how hard he had worked to honor the surname of a family to which, according to the recent revelations, he was not related by blood. A tight knot formed in his throat, and suddenly he realized he needed to share his anguish with someone who would not judge him. At that very moment, Eleanor peeked her head through the door, as though she had sensed his distress. Noticing his expression, she immediately saw something was different. His eyes, usually calm and kind, were clouded with a worry she could not fully comprehend. Without a word, she sat next to him and rested a hand on his shoulder. Voice trembling, Daniel told her the truth that tormented him. He wasn't a Smith by blood. He didn't carry in his veins the lineage he'd always believed was essential to his sense of self. Elena, far from showing surprise or disapproval, embraced him gently, conveying the serenity he so desperately needed. "You're not any less valuable for that, Daniel," she murmured firmly. "You've helped so many people, saved lives, and given hope to those who had nothing. No one can take away who you are on the inside." Her words soothed some of the pain crushing him. Still, his questions about the past remained. After talking with Elena for a while, he decided that for his own peace of mind, he would have to search for his biological mother. It wasn't mere whim, but rather a need to understand who he truly was and how his story had begun long before that stormy night when Amelia and Victor found him. While Daniel struggled with this revelation, news of his origins quickly spread through the corridors of the Smith mansion. The household staff, silent observers forever trading rumors, lost no time in making comments that reached Leonard's ears. Ever ready to seize an opportunity for greater influence, Victor's brother put two and two together and realized the magnitude of this bombshell. If Daniel was not a Smith by birth, there might be a way to dispute his legitimacy and remove him from the line of inheritance. Leonard took pleasure in the idea, although he kept it to himself. In his mind, this was a golden chance to gain absolute control of the company. He mulled over how best to use this information at the perfect moment, perhaps at a board meeting or during the reading of Victor's will, given the older man's uncertain health. All the while, he hid behind a mask of false concern for his brother's recovery in front of the rest of the family. At the same time, Sandra, the head of finance at the foundation, discovered signs of irregularities in the accounts for several charity projects. She had spent days reviewing invoices and receipts that did not add up, and the deeper she dug, the more convinced she became that someone was siphoning off funds for unknown purposes. When she confided in Daniel, she noticed his obvious distress, yet he showed willingness to help investigate the matter fully. They agreed to meet soon with the family lawyer and go over the documents in detail, aware that any financial scandal could jeopardize the foundation's reputation. Meanwhile, Amelia stayed at the hospital by Victor's side, never leaving his bedside and clinging to the hope that he would pull through. She felt deeply guilty for having been complicit in keeping so many secrets, but also dreaded what would happen if Daniel's search unearthed painful truths about the mother who had abandoned him. As for Victor, half conscious, he lived with the regret of having waited too long to tell his son the truth. With tensions running high, the atmosphere at the Smith mansion had grown cold and stifling. In his quest for answers, Daniel felt both determined and fearful. He knew each step he took might bring to light secrets nobody was ready to face. For him, there was no other option. He could remain in the dark about his past, or summon the courage to pursue the truth to its ultimate consequences, even if that meant reopening old family wounds. Thus, amid the legal maneuvers Leonard was setting in motion, the suspicions of corruption Sandra was investigating, and Victor's deteriorating health, Daniel felt his only choice was to act quickly. He realized that the time to look into his birth mother's whereabouts was now, before the situation at both the family and the foundation escalated out of control. With Elena's support and the hope that the truth would fill the hollow space gnawing at him, he prepared to embark on a path that would lead him not only to discover the face of his mother, but also to confront the maelstrom of conflicts brewing around the Smith family. In this flurry of uncertainty, he refused to let doubt paralyze him. As difficult as it was, he knew the moment had come to take action, to gather the clues he needed and face the consequences of bringing a silent past into the light. And so, Daniel set out on the path that, without his knowing, would force him to confront long-standing rivalries, unbridled ambitions, and perhaps even a reunion with the woman who had left him on a doorstep that stormy night. For several days, Daniel threw himself into a frenzied search for information. He filled notebooks with notes, dates, and references to cases of child abandonment from about 25 years ago. His efforts led him to visit government offices, libraries, and adoption archives, where the surprised employees did their best to help. A mixture of anxiety and hope welled in him each time he found a record that might shed light on his biological mother's whereabouts. In every place he pored over old reports and dusty documents, some yellowed with age, digging through unclaimed birth certificates, juvenile court files, and newspaper clippings that hinted at incidents from that era. Though the stories seemed disjointed and at times contradictory, Daniel never gave up. His determination to find the woman who had once set him down at the threshold of the Smith mansion drove his every step. Finally, in a nearly forgotten office in the city, he came across a file that caught his attention. It told the story of a woman named Maria who, according to the document, had fled a violent situation with a months-old baby in her arms. The report matched several details from the scant information on the note that had accompanied him on that rainy night. The name Daniel and references to constant abuse. He read carefully how the woman had escaped to protect her son, leaving behind only a domestic violence complaint against her partner, a man named Richard. Daniel's heart skipped a beat at the sight of that name, wondering if this man might be his biological father. Deciding to make copies of all the documents he could, Daniel knew he finally had a promising lead. Still, he wanted to be sure that this Maria was indeed the person who had left him at the mansion. According to the few references in the file, the woman had vanished after filing her complaint, most likely fleeing to another state to avoid retaliation. The report also mentioned multiple physical abuse injuries, which aligned with the account of someone who might have left her baby to save him from a dire situation. As Daniel pressed on with his investigation, tensions continued to mount both inside and outside the Smith mansion. Leonard, never missing an opportunity to hatch conspiracies, intensified his dealings with Nacho Rosales, a business rival of the family. They met in discreet offices and secluded corners of upscale restaurants, pretending to discuss trivial business deals. However, their true aim was to hammer out a perfect strategy to discredit Daniel. They planned to use his adopted status to paint him as an imposter, unworthy of any claim to the Smith fortune. They were well aware of Victor's fragile condition and guessed that, should things take a turn for the worse, urgent decisions would be made about the company and inheritance. Leonard was ready to strike the moment conditions were right. His goal was to position himself as the legitimate heir to the family legacy, allowing Nacho Rosales to buy up shares at bargain prices. From Leonard's point of view, it was a perfect scheme, ruin Daniel's reputation while strengthening his own hold on Smith Corporation. Meanwhile, at the foundation, Sandra felt increasingly certain that the financial discrepancies she had uncovered bore Leonard's signature. The bank records showed suspicious transfers right before supposed investments in charitable projects that never materialized. Checks made out to non-existent companies and invoices from phony suppliers were clear signs of a plan to weaken Daniel's humanitarian efforts, undermine his credibility, and funnel money into some hidden pocket. Sandra's task was no small feat. She needed to amass irrefutable evidence to accuse Leonard without risking her own position or facing false charges. Yet her sense of justice, along with the respect she had for Daniel, pushed her onward. She stayed in regular contact with the Smith family lawyer, who urged her to keep investigating and meticulously document each suspicious transaction. For his part, Daniel remained unaware of the grand conspiracy unfolding around him. His thoughts were absorbed by the mystery of his biological mother. Each night, returning to the foundation or the mansion, he reread the files on Maria and Richard, trying to piece together the story. His feelings ranged from anxiety to compassion. He could not judge a woman whose circumstances he knew nothing about, yet it hurt to think he had been abandoned. Deep down, he felt compelled to honor whatever sacrifice she had made to keep him safe. Days went by in a clash of hope and tension. Strengthened by his conviction that he was following the right lead, Daniel planned a visit to the city mentioned in the file, hoping to talk with former neighbors or anyone who might have known Maria. Meanwhile, Leonard and Rosales refined their strategy to bring him down, and Sandra gathered more and more proof of financial wrongdoing. The stage was set, poised for an inevitable confrontation. In this way, Daniel's search for truth about his mother intertwined with the impending assault that loomed over him. He could not guess how intertwined these two paths would become, or how painful it would be to confront what had stayed buried for so long. Still, he refused to stop. Maria's trail called to him from the past, and its call was as urgent as his need to defend what, though not tied by Smith blood, he believed was his home and his destiny. Victor's health took a sudden turn for the worse, plunging the family into deep sorrow. A stabbing pain in his chest, which he had tried to hide for weeks, finally grew too powerful, leaving him bedridden. Amelia stayed by his side, keeping vigil through his restless sleep, praying for a miracle. When Daniel received the news at the foundation, he rushed to the hospital, devastated, determined to be with his father through the most critical hours of his life. Once in the room, Daniel tried to remain the professional doctor he was trained to be, but affection soon overwhelmed him. He took Victor's hands gently, remembering in silence every lesson and each moment they had shared at the mansion. Though he was accustomed to maintaining composure in emergencies, this time, filial love mingled with dread. The specialists did everything they could, but Victor's fragile state kept him from overcoming the cardiac crisis. Victor's final words echoed gently through the hospital hallways. With a broken voice and eyes brimming with gratitude, he told Daniel how much he loved him and how proud he was to have raised him as a true son. Amelia, drying her tears, listened to these final confessions with her heart in knots. Victor died soon after, leaving the family in a grief unlike anything they had known before. The entire city received the news with dismay, for many admired the Smith patriarch for his philanthropic work and leadership. A few days later, following the solemn funeral, it was time to read the will. Close friends and family members gathered in the mansion's main office, where a notary, wearing a somber expression, unfolded the documents that contained Victor's final wishes. As anticipation thickened the air, Leonard feigned a stoic mourning, while inwardly longing to see what he could gain from the situation. When the notary began reading, everyone's expressions shifted to amazement. To the surprise of many, Victor named Daniel, alongside Amelia, as the primary heir to the family's assets and shares. This was an unmistakable gesture of love and unwavering trust. He placed Smith Corporation, as well as the responsibility to sustain the foundation and the charitable works he had championed for decades, into the hands of his adoptive son and his wife. Deeply moved, Daniel felt that his father's final act was a clear message of faith in his abilities and in the values he had always upheld. Leonard's reaction was immediate. With his face drained of color, he declared at once that he would contest the will. Amid the murmurs of those present, he insisted Daniel was not a legitimate Smith and therefore had no right to inherit. He claimed that Victor's arrangement went against inheritance laws and threatened a legal battle to seize control of the corporation. His words ignited a family tension that swiftly manifested as arguments and clashes between those who supported Daniel and those who sided with Leonard out of self-interest or fear. In this tumultuous atmosphere, Amelia, still reeling from her husband's death, tried to act as peacemaker. However, everyone's emotions were running too high. Grief, entwined with ambition and old grudges, turned each conversation into a spark, threatening to trigger a new confrontation. Whispers about lawsuits, hidden documents, and treacherous alliances filled the corners of the mansion. Meanwhile, Daniel felt overwhelmed by the loss of Victor and by the new pressures weighing on his shoulders. Each time he recalled his father's words, he was reminded of the importance of safeguarding the foundation and its mission to help those in need. Still, that purpose did not erase the void he felt when thinking about his origins. Although being adopted did not diminish one bit of the Smith family's love, his heart compelled him to keep seeking answers about his biological mother. He longed to find her, to understand her, and perhaps to heal the wounds that had lain hidden behind the veneer of adoption. Even amid the vortex of the family dispute, Daniel could not ignore that inner call. His desire to uncover his roots only grew more intense after Victor's death, as he had lost the last tangible connection to the night he was discovered on the mansion's doorstep. He felt that only by discovering the whole truth could he fully honor the legacy of the father who had trusted him so completely. Resolute, he promised himself not to abandon his search for Maria, even if it meant stirring the troubled waters of the past and confronting agonizing truths. This was how Victor Smith's final days ended, leaving his family in the grip of uncertainty and heartbreak, and Daniel with a will that, beyond any financial considerations, represented a moral responsibility. Bearing his father's memory and an inherited surname he did not share by blood, the young man set off on a new stretch of his journey. To protect the legacy of a good man and at the same time piece together his own missing identity. In this crossroads, the mansion once again fell silent, awaiting the next storm in the form of legal battles and revelations about the past. Amelia's voice, both loving and worried, reverberated in Daniel's mind as he drove along a dusty road, bound for the rural area where his clues had led him. Aware of her adoptive son's pain, she had encouraged him not to give up. After Victor's passing and the uncertainty now reigning in the mansion, Daniel felt that the only path to inner peace lay in uncovering the entire story of his origins. Following the scant information from old records and scattered testimonies, he arrived in a remote town where houses sprang up like spots in a landscape of parched fields and unpaved roads. The blazing sun cast ochre hues over the terrain and poured forth a suffocating heat. Daniel stopped his car in front of a small shop, cautiously asking if anyone knew a woman named Maria who had fled the city many years ago. The store owner, an old woman with a shrewd gaze, studied him for a moment before pointing out an address on the outskirts of town. Continuing on foot along a barely visible path, Daniel noticed how dust rose with every step, briefly clouding his vision and filling his shoes with grit. All the while, he thought about the various scenarios he had imagined of his birth mother. Would she be cold and distant, incapable of loving him? Or would she be consumed by guilt and sorrow for abandoning him? He shuddered at the memory of Amelia and Victor's words, recalling how they had secretly kept the blanket and note that had accompanied him that stormy night. Eventually, he found himself before a humble dwelling built of cement blocks and old wood. Its corrugated metal roof creaked under the scorching sun. Heart pounding, Daniel knocked softly on the door, overcome by an unfamiliar sense of vertigo. A few seconds passed before the latch turned with a quiet scrape, revealing the figure of a thin woman, her shoulders bowed by weariness. Her hands, cracked from fieldwork, held the door with hesitation. She barely raised her eyes to look at Daniel, but her face spoke of suspicion. He swallowed hard as he carefully pulled a worn blanket from his pocket. It was the same one in which he had been found at the Smith mansion all those years ago. Upon seeing it, the woman covered her mouth with one hand, stifling a choked cry. Her eyes grew misty with tears, and her whole frame trembled almost imperceptibly. "Is it really you?" she murmured brokenly, too afraid to pronounce the name sewn onto the blanket. Daniel nodded silently, struggling to contain the surge of emotions washing over him. At that moment, he knew, no more words were needed, that he was standing before Maria, the woman who had left him at the mansion's doorstep. He felt a sudden wave of dizziness as he looked at her, skin roughened by the sun, graying hair, and eyes framed by lines of sorrow and hard labor. Maria burst into tears with sobs that shook her slender shoulders, holding onto the doorframe to keep from collapsing. Daniel stepped forward cautiously, wary of overwhelming her. He drew close enough to hand her the blanket, which she clutched as though it held the memory of an entire life. Through that worn cloth, she could revisit the dark night and ceaseless storm that had compelled her to make such a painful decision. "I left you to save you," she admitted between sobs. "Richard, he was so violent. The beatings were unbearable, and I feared he'd end up killing both of us. I couldn't take you with me when I fled. I had nowhere to go, no money, no one to turn to." Stunned, Daniel listened quietly, feeling the knot in his chest begin to unravel with each of her words. At the same time, an immense sadness engulfed him as he pictured the terror of a mother forced to give up her baby to protect him. Still crying, Maria went on describing how she had tried to disappear, moving constantly and surviving on odd jobs. She had never dared ask about him, convinced that if she got too close, Richard or someone else would track her down. "I feared you might be dead," she added, so softly her voice almost vanished. "Every night I prayed someone kind would find you and give you what I couldn't." Daniel moved near and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. He looked into her eyes, wanting to convey that he was there of his own free will, not to condemn her. In a halting voice, he spoke about the family who had taken him in, about the values Amelia and Victor had taught him, and about the education that had enabled him to become a doctor. He described the Smith mansion, his adoptive father's generosity, and his mother's concern, which lasted even into her final moments when guilt over so many years of silence weighed upon her. Hearing this, Maria broke down again. She never imagined the helpless baby she had left behind with only a note would grow into a kind, generous man devoted to medicine and charitable work. For her, this reunion provided a release she had never expected, one shadowed by guilt, but also offering a glimmer of redemption, proof that her desperate sacrifice had borne fruit. Daniel, for his part, felt that, even though many years had passed, he was finally reconnecting with his true origin. The fear and anguish of not knowing why he had been abandoned began to fade, replaced by an understanding of the tragedy behind that desperate choice. He took Maria's hand, letting her know without words that he did not hate her. On the contrary, he thanked her for the love that had saved him from Richard's violence in its most wrenching form. In the silence that followed, they exchanged a new, tentative bond. Their meeting was tinged with sorrow, but also lit by the hope of rebuilding a connection that had been severed for 25 years. Thus, in that humble home surrounded by dusty fields, Daniel understood his journey would not end simply because he had found his biological mother. Rather, it was only beginning. There were still wounds to heal, hidden truths to uncover, and above all, a need to shield Maria from any darkness that might threaten the hard-won peace she had carved out for herself. Maria and Daniel remained in the modest living room, both still shaken by their reunion. After so many years apart, each word they shared seemed a step toward understanding a painful past. Her voice barely steady, she explained that Richard had never stopped hunting for her during all that time. She feared not only for herself, but also for Lucy, her other daughter, now 24. Startled, Daniel turned his gaze to the door of the small adjoining room where Lucy stood silently, eavesdropping. Aware of the gravity of the situation, Lucy hesitated before stepping out, but the gentleness in Daniel's voice encouraged her to show herself. The anxiety and resentment etched into her features spoke of a life shaped by constant fear and frequent relocations. They had fled from one place to another, always afraid Richard would find them. Upon seeing her, Daniel felt a pang of compassion. Not only was she his half-sister, but also another victim of the man who had so brutally endangered Maria's life. As they talked, Maria recounted in detail the beatings she had endured after Lucy's birth. She explained that, following Daniel's abandonment on the mansion's doorstep, she had tried to rebuild her life far from Richard, but he always managed to track her down. Sometimes he appeared, demanding money or forcing his presence on them with aggression. That harassment forced the mother and daughter to move repeatedly, never daring to trust anyone. Listening, Daniel realized the depth of the terror that plagued both women. Their reunion did not remain secret for long. A local acquaintance, who often visited the area's tavern, rushed to inform Richard that someone with refined manners and the look of a doctor had been wandering around town, asking about Maria. That alone was enough to enrage Richard. With his pride wounded, he decided it was time to regain the control which, in his twisted mind, he believed he had never lost. To him, Maria and Lucy were still his property, and the thought of a stranger's involvement stoked his fury even more. One night, with the humble house enveloped in quiet beneath a starry sky, Richard barged in armed, slamming the door open without warning. The crash instantly set Daniel on alert as he sat reviewing some documents that might help Maria legally. Eyes wild with hatred, Richard demanded that both women return with him. Lucy, terrified, froze at the sight of him, while Maria backed away until she was almost pressed against the wall, trembling at the memory of past beatings. Daniel stood his ground without hesitation. Though the sight of a weapon unnerved him, he could not allow Richard to drag them back to the hell they had escaped. The intruder's face contorted in rage, and without warning, he lunged at Daniel, triggering a tense scuffle. Grunts, panting breaths, and the crash of overturned furniture echoed through the living room as Lucy, her heart pounding, struggled to figure out how to help. She suddenly remembered her phone lying on the kitchen table and, summoning her courage, dashed off to call for help. Her call yielded swift results. The local police, accustomed to minor incidents in the otherwise tranquil area, responded immediately to a frantic report of threats with a firearm. Patrol cars arrived almost at once. While Daniel grappled with Richard, trying to disarm him, the officers burst into the house, shouting at everyone to stand down. Taken by surprise and outnumbered, Richard was firmly subdued and promptly arrested. Even then, his fury did not abate. He hurled curses at Daniel, Maria, and Lucy, vowing revenge sooner or later. With handcuffs on and the police combing the scene, Daniel slumped against the wall, exhausted. Maria rushed to his side, hugging him in shaky relief, grateful for his bravery. Lucy, for her part, gazed at him through tear-filled eyes, realizing that this stranger, her half-brother, had just risked his own life to save them. The relief of seeing Richard in cuffs mixed with a persistent fear. They knew a man like him would not give up easily. That night, amid the chaos, Daniel and Maria understood how close they had come to disaster. At the same time, in their shared embrace, they felt a new strength, the conviction that they would not face this battle alone. If Richard had succeeded once in destroying their lives, they would not let him do it again. Once the patrol car pulled away, mother, son, and sister clung to one another in a charged silence, promising to stand by each other. Although the danger was far from over, they had taken the first step toward reclaiming their freedom and dignity. The tension of the previous night still clouded Maria's and Lucy's eyes when Daniel persuaded them to come with him to the Smith mansion. It seemed inconceivable that, after so many years of fear and running, anyone would offer them a safe haven, and above all, the possibility of rebuilding their lives without the perpetual threat of Richard. Still, following the armed attack and the temporary detention of their abuser, prudence dictated they remain with Daniel until their legal situation was sorted out. The drive back was brief, but during it, Maria could not stop watching her son through grateful, tearful eyes. She recalled how, only the night before, he had risked his own safety to protect them. Lucy kept silent, overwhelmed by the dizzying sequence of events. A man she barely knew had put himself in harm's way to keep Richard from ruining their lives further. Now this same man was taking them to a place that, for mother and daughter, existed only as a name associated with wealth and grandeur. When they finally reached the gates of the Smith mansion, they were greeted by immaculate gardens and polished stone walkways leading to a grand entrance. Both women felt their nerves spike. Maria's hands trembled slightly, afraid her presence might be unwelcome in a house that, despite belonging partly to Daniel, was also rife with long-standing family tensions. Lucy kept her eyes lowered, burdened by a sense of not belonging. She felt like an outsider, weighed down by a history of poverty and violence. Amelia came out to meet them. The respect and warmth with which she greeted Maria and Lucy took both by surprise. The woman they had heard of only by name turned out to be a genuinely nurturing presence, with the compassionate heart of someone who knows what it means to lose a child and live without news of him for years. Amelia led them kindly through the foyer, encouraging them to set aside the anxieties consuming them. She offered them rooms adjacent to Daniel's, so they would not feel alone in such unfamiliar surroundings. The culture shock was inevitable. While Lucy stared wide-eyed at the luxurious tapestries and floor-to-ceiling windows, letting in the morning light, Maria could not help feeling a mixture of awe and apprehension. Yet more than the gilded mirrors and plush carpets, what moved them was the sincerity of this family's hospitality. People who, technically, owed them nothing. Just seeing Daniel smile at them naturally, drawing them into his routine, began to dissolve some of the misgivings they had carried for so long. Still, the calm did not last long. The legal landscape had become a veritable battlefield. The arrival of Maria and Lucy at the mansion was fresh ammunition for Leonard, whose hostility toward Daniel was steadily increasing. Discovering that his adoptive brother had found his birth mother and invited her to live under the same roof bolstered Daniel's standing in the public eye. Leonard's claims that Daniel was an impostor with no right to inherit rang hollow in the face of such a moving family reunion. Yet he refused to yield. Meanwhile, Sandra, head of finance at the foundation, was making great strides in her investigation of the financial misappropriation that threatened to sink their charitable projects. For weeks, she had been reviewing account statements, inflated invoices, and suspicious transfers. The possibility of collusion between Leonard and businessman Nacho Rosales loomed ever larger. Evidence of secret meetings and substantial payments to frontmen pointed to a scheme of corruption designed to undermine Daniel, tarnishing his reputation and that of the foundation. Carrying a thick file, Sandra requested a meeting with Amelia and Daniel. She presented documents confirming the embezzlement committed against the Smith Foundation, showcasing staggering figures that did not match donations or the actual costs of medical campaigns. She explained in detail how, over recent months, a large portion of the funds had been diverted to offshore accounts, part of a covert maneuver orchestrated by Leonard and Nacho Rosales. Daniel was shaken to his core by the revelation. He felt betrayed, but also quietly enraged to see the charitable work, carried on with so much effort and in Victor's memory, jeopardized by the greed of his uncle and his associates. Amelia, looking distraught, did not hesitate for a moment to back Sandra in presenting the evidence to the board of directors and, if necessary, filing criminal charges against Leonard. The thought of going to war with a family member unsettled her, but she believed that justice and integrity must prevail. The situation became even more complicated when Leonard, incensed that Maria and Lucy were being sheltered in the mansion, tried to slander Daniel. In influential circles, he insinuated that his adoptive brother was merely capitalizing on the sentimental appeal of saving his birth family to cement his inheritance rights. However, the mounting proof of corruption made those rumors ring hollow. The harder Leonard tried to smear Daniel, the more his own conduct came under scrutiny. With Sandra's formal complaint imminent, the atmosphere in the mansion grew tense. The staff avoided speaking aloud, wary of Leonard's temper, while the corporation's executives braced themselves for the fallout. Daniel, for his part, shouldered a heavy burden. He wanted to defend Victor's legacy with honor and ensure that his birth mother and sister could live in dignity and safety. And so, the old home that had once witnessed laughter and celebrations became the stage for an impending legal war. While Maria and Lucy attempted to adjust to Amelia's kindness and the mansion's daily life, Daniel and Sandra prepared to expose the scale of Leonard's shady dealings. Against a backdrop of lawsuits, financial investigations, and the promise to protect his newly reunited family, Daniel recognized that this battle would determine not only the future of the corporation, but also the long-overdue chance to close the wounds first inflicted 25 years ago. Morning light streamed into the courtroom, where the hearing to challenge Victor Smith's will was finally set to begin. Curious onlookers and reporters thronged the hallways, drawn by the media frenzy surrounding a case that mingled family intrigue, multi-million-dollar inheritances, and corruption charges. In the front row, Daniel, heart-pounding, steeled himself for the legal fight that would decide the future of the Smith mansion, the corporation, and in many ways, his own life. Seated beside him was Amelia, her expression calm yet unwavering, determined to uphold her husband's wishes and the rights of the adoptive son she had loved and raised as though he were her own flesh and blood. Behind them, Maria and Lucy observed the scene in awe and apprehension, acutely aware of how foreign all this legal formality felt. Even so, they sensed the urgency in witnessing the resolution of a saga of betrayal and ambition that had deeply affected them, directly or indirectly. On the opposing side sat Leonard, brow furrowed and exuding an air of feigned superiority. He wore a faultless suit, but his resentful gaze revealed what lay beneath. Next to him, Nacho Rosales stood stiffly, clearly uncomfortable with the documents the prosecution was about to produce. Leonard's lawyer, posture rigid, was set to argue the alleged illegitimacy of Daniel's inheritance, though worry flickered on his face. He knew the evidence against his client was overwhelming. Proceedings opened with statements from Leonard and his defense. They claimed Daniel could not inherit from Victor because there was no blood relationship legally tying him to the Smith family. Additionally, they sought to invalidate the will itself, asserting that Victor had not been of sound mind when it was drafted. The judge, neutral in demeanor, listened attentively, taking note of each point raised by the plaintiff. However, the family attorney, Laura, had prepared a robust case in support of Daniel and Amelia. She presented documentation confirming Daniel's legal adoption, completed at the time in accordance with all relevant regulations. Letters notarized by friends of the family were also introduced, indicating that Victor had repeatedly expressed his desire for Daniel to be his heir. Furthermore, witnesses affirmed that Victor was entirely lucid when writing the will. Neither his heart condition nor his advanced age had impaired his decision-making ability. As the judge assessed this evidence, it was Sandra's turn to take the stand, accompanied by Laura, representing the Smith Foundation's finances. Together, they unveiled a file full of account statements, bank transfers, and falsified invoices detailing clandestine movement of funds to shell companies. These documents directly implicated Leonard and Nacho Rosales in the embezzlement of Foundation assets. With methodical precision, Sandra showed how stealthy, incremental transactions had drained the budgets allocated to medical campaigns and social programs. Leonard seethed with barely contained anger. He stood to deny the accusations, claiming he was the victim of a plot to discredit him. Yet each time he raised his voice, Sandra and the attorney countered his claims with verifiable facts, exposing the scope of the corruption. Nacho Rosales, for his part, grew visibly tense, aware that each paper presented to the court further multiplied the charges against him. After several hours of debate and evidence review, the judge gave a preliminary ruling. The first order of business was to dismiss Leonard's challenge to Daniel's alleged illegitimacy. The adoption records were in perfect order, and Victor's explicit intention was clearly documented in the will. There was no indication whatsoever that he had been mentally unfit when drafting it. In issuing that decision, the judge confirmed Daniel's legitimacy as heir and recognized the rights Victor had chosen to confer on him. After that, the judge ordered a thorough investigation of the Smith Corporation's and Foundation's accounts in light of the evidence of corruption and embezzlement. The final blow against Leonard and Nacho Rosales came when it was confirmed that the diverted funds largely consisted of donations channeled through the Foundation. This amounted to a far more serious crime, as it not only defrauded the family business, but also the community and the beneficiaries of the humanitarian programs. Upon hearing the verdict, Nacho Rosales, seized by panic, tried to flee before they could arrest him. However, alerted by the court, law enforcement officers intercepted him as he tried to leave the building, escorting him straight to a holding cell. Leonard, face pale and drawn, realized his reputation had been shattered in front of everyone. There was no room left for stalling tactics, since criminal charges now loomed over him. Inside the courtroom, onlookers watched every moment of the scene with bated breath. Amelia gripped Daniel's hand tightly, holding back tears of relief. Maria and Lucy exchanged looks, uncertain whether to applaud or feel pity for the man who, up to that point, had been part of the family that welcomed them in. After all, the tragedy of greed affects not only those who indulge in it, but also those who once placed their trust in a celebrated name. With the reading of the judgment and the confirmation that Daniel and Amelia would retain the inheritance and control of Smith Corporation, a sense of victory lingered in the air. Yet it was not a triumph that gave rise to unbridled joy. Daniel, his feelings bittersweet, understood that justice had prevailed, but the price of family betrayals, secrets, and avarice had been too high. Silently, he vowed to honor Victor's memory and to carry on the charity work, using this success not for personal gain, but to serve others, just as his father would have advised. Thus, the courtroom doors closed on the accused, seemingly bringing a turbulent chapter in the Smith family's history to an end. Now Daniel and Amelia faced the challenge of repairing the damage caused by corruption, restoring confidence in the corporation, and, above all, continuing the legacy of kindness and humanity that Victor had championed until his final days. In Daniel's mind echoed the conviction that, despite not sharing the family bloodline, he had inherited their most valuable treasure, the capacity to love and protect those in need, just as they had done for him one far-off, rain-swept night. The echo of the final hearing faded as the days passed, granting the Smith family a peace they had not known before. After the conclusive court ruling, there was no longer any reason to fear Leonard's schemes or to worry about Nacho Rosales' attempts at seizing control of the corporation. Under Daniel and Amelia's guidance, firmly backed by the Foundation, the family business regained its shine, while the charitable projects once again expanded to benefit those who needed it most. Maria and Lucy, finally free from Richard's yoke, gradually adapted to life at the mansion. At first, every hallway seemed vast, every room an overwhelming place filled with luxury. Yet the genuine affection they received helped them feel increasingly at ease. Lucy, in particular, experienced for the first time the stability needed to dream of a different future. She began to take a keen interest in the Smith Foundation's work, inspired by stories of women and children receiving aid. She saw in Daniel a model of dedication, and in Elena, a nurse who had worked alongside him, a mentor willing to guide her into the world of community healthcare. Elena, for her part, realized that working together at the Foundation brought her closer to Daniel. She admired not only his devotion to medicine, but also the empathy he showed in every case he handled. The months they had spent organizing vaccination campaigns and traveling to marginalized regions strengthened a bond of affection they could no longer hide. With the legal turmoil behind them, they finally allowed themselves the chance to confirm what both had sensed for a while. Their mutual respect was blossoming into love. Meanwhile, Amelia, deeply pained by Victor's absence, found solace in Daniel's care and in Maria's understanding. The two women forged a bond that transcended their past hardships. On one hand, Maria understood that Amelia's devotion had allowed Daniel to grow into a noble and generous man. On the other, Amelia recognized the ultimate sacrifice of a mother who, despite her own anguish, had protected her baby from a tragic fate. Two very different stories, yet intertwined by their love for the same son, had merged into a relationship grounded in gratitude. Soon after, the family organized a public event to honor Victor's memory. The gathering included many corporate collaborators and people who had benefited from the foundation over the years. Standing at the front, Daniel delivered an emotional tribute to his adoptive father, emphasizing the generous vision that had always guided Smith's philanthropic efforts. Amid applause and teary eyes, he announced the expansion of the foundation through more ambitious programs, including one devoted especially to victims of domestic violence, paying homage to the courage his biological mother had shown in escaping Richard and saving him from that environment. Maria and Lucy stood off to the side of the stage, moved by this unexpected tribute that spoke to their own experiences. They watched the crowd react, realizing how resilience and hope can emerge from a dark past if one allows it to become a lesson in overcoming adversity. From her seat, Amelia affirmed Daniel's words with nods of approval, proud to see him continuing the work they had defended together with Victor. As the ceremony ended, Daniel took a moment to reflect on the future taking shape before him. There were Amelia, Maria, and Lucy, his two mothers and his sister, united by the shared warmth of their mutual love. And beside them stood Elena, his co-worker, companion in hardships, and the person whose affection had grown strongest during the most difficult hours. In that instant, he knew that blood alone did not define family. The desire to protect, heal, and love was a bond far more powerful than any lineage. He recalled the stormy night that had brought him here, wrapped in a stranger's blanket and left at the mansion's door. He imagined how many times, in the dark, Maria must have wept for leaving him behind, and how many times Victor and Amelia must have prayed for him. Now he saw clearly that the dreadful storm of the past had given way to a new dawn, bright and filled with hope. Embracing the memory of those sacrifices and the promise of a brighter future, the Smith family stepped forward into a new era, bound by the past, upheld by the present, and determined to face tomorrow with solidarity and resolve. This story reminds us that family is not always defined by blood, but by love and the willingness to protect one another. It shows how the most painful decisions can be guided by the hope for a better future. At the same time, it teaches us that adversity can give rise to the strength needed to support those in suffering. Each sacrifice holds a seed of compassion that over time can blossom into a legacy of solidarity, justice, and second chances. And that's the end of today's story, friends. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us. This adventure reminds us that true family can be forged by bonds of love and unity, beyond mere blood. If you enjoyed this content, be sure to give it a like and subscribe so you can join us for more stories brimming with emotion and life lessons. We'll see you in the next video. Always remember that a warm home is built on the willingness to care for one another.